It had been a long day for Maya Carter. A day filled with meetings, endless phone calls, and constant deliberation over cases that would soon be heard by the Supreme Court. As one of the few black women to ever hold a position on the nation's highest judicial body, Maya was no stranger to pressure. But today, the weight of her responsibilities felt heavier than usual. She had just come from a tense, closed-door discussion about a highly controversial case involving voting rights, a decision that could reshape the country's democratic landscape. Despite her calm demeanor, Maya's mind was still racing with the implications of the case as she walked briskly through the courthouse doors, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the marble steps. Unlike many of her colleagues, Maya did not indulge in the luxuries that her status could afford. She preferred a quiet life outside the courtroom, deliberately avoiding the spotlight whenever possible. Her modesty was a reflection of her values, her belief that justice was not about power, but about fairness and humility. As she walked towards her car, a plain sedan that blended into the sea of vehicles in the city, she exhaled slowly, hoping to decompress from the day's stress. Her weekend was meant to be a time for relaxation, a brief respite from the demands of her role, but that peaceful escape was now threatened by an unexpected crisis. Her phone buzzed in her bag. Maya's heart sank as she read the message from her younger sister, Alicia. There had been an accident. Alicia had been hit by a car while crossing the street near her home. Though the message didn't specify the extent of her injuries, Maya's pulse quickened. The words hospital and emergency filled her with dread. Alicia had been her rock, her closest confidante, and despite the heavy burdens of her career, Maya always made time for her family. Without thinking twice, she shoved her phone back into her bag and hurried to her car. Unfortunately, as Maya turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered weakly before dying altogether. Panic flared in her chest. Of all the times for her car to fail, this was the worst possible moment. With no time to call for assistance, she glanced around, searching for alternatives. Her eyes landed on a bicycle chained to a nearby rack. It wasn't hers, but she had seen the staff members use it to get around the courthouse. Without hesitating, she grabbed the bike, fumbling as she unlocked it. She was already running late, and her mind was singularly focused on reaching the hospital as quickly as possible. As Maya sped down the streets, the city seemed unusually quiet for a Friday afternoon. Most people were either heading home or settling into their routines for the evening, oblivious to the drama unfolding in her life. Her hair, usually perfectly styled, became disheveled in the wind as she pedaled furiously, weaving through pedestrians on the sidewalks and cutting through narrow alleys to save time. She knew that riding on the sidewalk wasn't exactly legal, but right now the rules seemed insignificant compared to the urgency of the situation. Her mind was clouded with worry for her sister, and each pedal stroke was a frantic attempt to reach the hospital in time. The strain of the day, combined with the physical exertion, was starting to weigh on her. She was not dressed for this. Her heels had been hastily tossed into her bag, and her black slacks were beginning to stick to her legs with sweat. Her blouse, once crisp and professional, now clung to her in the humidity. But Maya didn't care about appearances. She just needed to get to Alicia. Just as Maya rounded a corner near the hospital, she saw a black and white patrol car parked idly by the side of the road. For a fleeting moment, she thought nothing of it. But that changed when the officer inside, noticing her on the bike, flicked on his lights and began to pull up alongside her. Maya's heart sank. She was too close to stop now. She pushed the pedals harder, hoping to make it to the hospital entrance before the officer could catch up. But the flashing lights drew attention from bystanders, and suddenly, her route was blocked by the officer stepping out of his car and waving her down. The officer was young, likely in his early 30s, with a hardened expression and an air of authority that was palpable. Maya barely noticed the name Daniels on his uniform, but she did notice the judgment in his eyes. She had seen that look many times before. It was the look of someone who had already made up their mind about her based solely on her appearance, on her race, on her gender. In that brief moment, she felt like she had been reduced to just another person he believed didn't belong. She was no longer Maya Carter, Supreme Court Justice. She was just a black woman on a bike, sweating and rushing through the streets. Daniels approached her with quick strides, his voice cutting through the sounds of the city. "Ma'am, step off the bike," he commanded, his tone cold and unforgiving. Maya stopped, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She looked up at the officer, frustration and panic mixing in her chest. "Officer, I'm on my way to the hospital," she said, her voice straining to remain calm. "My sister was in an accident. Please, I don't have time for this." Daniels narrowed his eyes, clearly unimpressed. "You were riding on the sidewalk, and you almost hit someone. That's illegal. I need to see some ID." The world seemed to slow down around Maya. Her mind was screaming at her to just push past him, to get to Alicia, but her training as a judge held her back. She knew that resisting could escalate the situation, especially with someone like Daniels, who exuded the kind of unchecked authority she had fought against for years in the courtroom. Still, she had no time for this. "I don't have my ID with me right now," she said, her voice clipped. "I'm in a rush." Daniels crossed his arms, the muscles in his jaw tensing. "That's not my problem, ma'am. You're going to need to come with me." Maya blinked in disbelief. "I'm not under arrest. I'm just trying to get to the hospital." Daniels stepped closer, his hand hovering near the baton strapped to his belt. "I won't ask again. Step off the bike." Maya felt a surge of anger rise in her throat. She knew she could assert her authority. She knew she could tell him exactly who she was, but she didn't want to. She hated using her position as a weapon, as a way to escape situations like this. She believed in equality, in justice for all, and she knew that the moment she told him who she was, the dynamics would change. But she also knew that every second she stood here arguing with him was another second wasted, another second that could mean life or death for Alicia. Reluctantly, she stepped off the bike, her hands trembling with frustration. Daniels took a step back, his eyes scanning her up and down, as if trying to piece together her story. "Why don't you tell me why you're really in such a hurry?" he asked, suspicion lacing his words. Maya shook her head, exasperated. "I already told you. My sister is in the hospital. I need to see her." Daniels didn't seem convinced. He reached for his radio, ready to call in for backup, when suddenly the door of the hospital swung open and a nurse rushed out, calling for Maya. "Maya Carter. Judge Carter. Your sister is asking for you." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Daniels froze, the realization of who he had been detaining dawning on him with shocking clarity. Maya didn't wait for him to respond. She pushed past him, her eyes focused on the hospital doors ahead. Daniels stood motionless, the weight of his mistake sinking in. Maya rushed through the hospital doors, her heart still pounding from the confrontation outside. The sterile, bright lights of the hospital contrasted sharply with the chaos inside her mind. As she reached the reception desk, her thoughts were singularly focused on Alicia. The words "your sister is asking for you" echoed in her ears, drowning out everything else. She barely registered the nurse guiding her through the hallways, pointing her towards the intensive care unit. Her breath was uneven, not just from the exertion of her hurried trip, but from the rising anxiety that was coursing through her. The confrontation with Officer Daniels outside had rattled her more than she wanted to admit. In her years on the bench, Maya had seen and heard countless stories of individuals wrongfully detained, of citizens abused by authority figures, and now, in a sick twist of fate, she had been pulled into one of those very same situations. Yet, there was no time to dwell on the injustice her sister needed her. As the nurse led her down a narrow corridor, Maya caught glimpses of doctors and patients through the open doors of the hospital rooms. The medical staff moved with a practiced urgency, reminding her of the delicate nature of life within these walls. The faint beeping of heart monitors, the soft shuffle of feet, and the occasional murmur of conversation created a low hum that underscored the tension of the moment. It all seemed to blend into the background as Maya finally reached the door of Alicia's room. She paused, her hand hovering just above the door handle, her stomach churning with dread. She wasn't ready for what she might see inside. The sight of her sister, her strong, vibrant sister lying vulnerable in a hospital bed, was something she couldn't prepare for. But Maya steeled herself, pushing the door open gently. Inside, the room was quiet, save for the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. Alicia lay still, her face pale against the white hospital sheets, an oxygen tube nestled beneath her nose. There was a deep gash on her forehead, hastily bandaged by the paramedics who had brought her in. Her leg was in a cast, and bruises were already forming on her arms and cheeks. Despite the severity of her injuries, Alicia's eyes fluttered open as she sensed Maya's presence. Alicia's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but it was enough to bring tears to Maya's eyes. She rushed to her sister's side, carefully taking her hand and squeezing it gently. "I'm here," Maya said softly, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. "I'm here." Alicia tried to smile, but the pain was evident in her expression. "They said I was lucky," she murmured. "The driver, he didn't see me. They said it could have been worse." Maya nodded, blinking back tears. The sight of her sister in this state stirred a mix of emotions inside her: relief that she was alive, anger at the driver's carelessness, and a gnawing guilt that she hadn't been there to protect her. For a moment, the rest of the world seemed to fade away, and it was just the two of them, sisters bound by an unbreakable connection. Alicia's eyes drifted closed again as exhaustion overtook her, and Maya sat quietly by her side, watching her breathe. The rhythmic rise and fall of Alicia's chest became a focal point, something to cling to in the storm of emotions swirling around Maya's mind. She was grateful beyond words that her sister was alive, but the confrontation outside with Officer Daniels still lingered like a dark cloud over her relief. She hadn't had the time or energy to process what had happened with Daniels, but now, sitting in the stillness of the hospital room, it began to sink in. The realization that a simple misunderstanding, a desperate rush to reach her sister, had nearly escalated into something far worse gnawed at her. The weight of what could have happened if Daniels had chosen to arrest her, or worse, use force, was a terrifying thought. The system she had dedicated her life to protecting and upholding had almost betrayed her in that moment. But even deeper than her fear was her anger. Not just at Daniels, but at the entire system that allowed such injustices to occur. As a Supreme Court justice, Maya had spent years working to ensure that justice was served fairly and without bias. Yet, even she wasn't immune to the racial prejudices that plagued law enforcement. The irony was bitter, and it left a sour taste in her mouth. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. She turned to see the nurse from earlier standing in the doorway, holding a clipboard. "Judge Carter," the nurse said hesitantly. "There's a police officer outside asking to speak with you." Maya's stomach dropped. Of course, Daniels hadn't left. She had been so focused on getting to Alicia that she hadn't stopped to think about what he might be doing now. She was sure he had figured out who she was by now. He must have. The nurse's tone was polite but cautious, and Maya knew that her status as a judge had already begun to ripple through the hospital staff. She could feel the weight of their expectations, the way they now saw her as someone beyond just a concerned sister. She was a figure of authority, and that changed everything. Maya stood, giving her sister's hand one last squeeze before stepping out of the room. As she walked back through the hospital corridors, her mind raced. She had to confront Daniels, but how? She didn't want to escalate the situation further, but she also couldn't let this go unaddressed. There was a principle at stake now, one that went far beyond her personal safety. If someone like her could be treated this way, what hope was there for those who didn't have her power or influence? When she reached the lobby, Daniels was waiting by the reception desk, his posture stiff and uncomfortable. His eyes flicked nervously around the room, but the moment he saw her approaching, his face hardened again, trying to regain his sense of authority. But Maya could see the crack in his armor now. He knew he had made a mistake, and he was grappling with how to handle it. Maya crossed the lobby, her footsteps echoing against the tiled floor. She stopped just a few feet away from Daniels, her expression unreadable. The tension between them was palpable, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable, until Daniels finally cleared his throat. He hesitated, clearly unsure of what to say. The confidence he had shown earlier was gone, replaced by uncertainty and, Maya suspected, a touch of fear. I didn't realize. Maya raised an eyebrow. Didn't realize what, Officer Daniels? Didn't realize who I was? Or didn't realize that detaining a black woman on a bicycle without cause was an abuse of your authority? Daniels flinched at the sharpness of her words. He opened his mouth to respond, but Maya cut him off before he could say anything. I don't care that you didn't know who I was, she said coldly. What I care about is that you assumed the worst about me the moment you saw me. And that's not just a problem for me, Officer Daniels, that's a problem for every person of color in this city. Her words hung in the air, cutting through the silence like a knife. Daniels looked down at his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment. He was clearly out of his depth now, struggling to find a way to recover. I'm sorry, ma'am, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to release some of the tension in her body. You should be, she said quietly. But an apology isn't enough. Not anymore. Without another word, Maya turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing alone in the lobby, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As Maya made her way back to her sister's room, she felt a surge of resolve rising within her. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Daniels wasn't the first officer to misuse his power, and he wouldn't be the last. But as long as she had a voice, as long as she had the power to make change, she would fight to ensure that no one else would have to experience what she had. And this was just the beginning. As Maya walked back to Alicia's room, the confrontation with Officer Daniels lingered in her mind. The atmosphere in the hospital lobby had been suffocating. More than just a simple clash of authority, it was a moment that exposed something far deeper. Daniel's initial confidence had crumbled, and the discomfort in his eyes revealed a truth Maya had encountered many times before. Even trained officers operated under biases that clouded their judgment. In that instant, Maya chose to walk away, deciding not to escalate things further for now. But she hadn't forgotten, nor had she forgiven. Confrontation was not new to Maya. As a Supreme Court justice, she had faced some of the most difficult and emotionally charged cases in the country. Her experience had taught her how to recognize power imbalances, how to untangle the complexities of injustice. But this time it wasn't a case on her docket, it was personal. The law wasn't a distant ideal here. It was a force that had directly threatened her family, her life, her dignity. Daniels wasn't just another figure in the system, he was a manifestation of everything Maya had fought against for years. And she knew this was only the beginning. Back in Alicia's room, the steady hum of medical equipment provided a sense of calm amid the turmoil. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was a reminder that Alicia was still here, still breathing. Her sister lay still, her chest rising and falling softly, oblivious to the chaos outside. The peace inside this room was in sharp contrast to the thoughts spinning in Maya's mind. Maya sat beside her sister, gently smoothing Alicia's blanket. She hadn't told her about the incident with Daniels, there was no point in burdening her with it now. Alicia had enough to handle, but the anger still simmered just beneath the surface for Maya. How had a simple trip to the hospital turned into such a confrontation? How had a woman rushing to see her injured sister been treated as a suspect? Most troubling of all, Maya couldn't stop thinking about how many others, black women like her, had faced the same treatment, without the shield of a title or a high-profile job to protect them. Her thoughts circled back to Daniel's weak apology. It was nothing more than a reflex, a product of fear rather than genuine remorse. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough. Daniels was just one piece of a larger problem, a system that Maya had been fighting to change her entire career. But now that she was personally entangled in the issue, the fight felt more immediate, more pressing. Maya's phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Sarah, her assistant, was calling from the Supreme Court. Maya, I heard what happened. Are you all right? Sarah's voice was calm, but Maya could hear the underlying concern. Maya leaned back in her chair, massaging her temples. I'm fine. Alicia is stable, but it's been a long day. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Maya could hear the shuffle of papers, the distant ringing of phones. Sarah always seemed to be in the middle of something, managing the court's hectic workload. I hate to intrude, but word is already spreading, Sarah continued. There's chatter in the legal circles about what happened. People are talking. Maya closed her eyes and exhaled. Of course, the news would circulate quickly. The legal world was small, and a story involving a Supreme Court justice was bound to attract attention. But this wasn't the kind of attention Maya wanted. I didn't want this to become a public spectacle, Maya said, her voice firmer now. This doesn't need to turn into a distraction. I understand, Sarah replied carefully. But you know how these things go. People are already asking if you're going to take legal action. Maya clenched her jaw. The thought of suing Daniels or the department had crossed her mind, but she wasn't sure if that was the right course. It would be easy, she had the resources, the connections. But would it bring about any real change? Or would it just create more headlines, more controversy, while leaving the deeper issue unaddressed? I need time to think, Maya said finally. Of course. Take your time, Sarah reassured her. But know that whatever you choose, you've got a lot of support. Maya thanked her and ended the call. The conversation had added to the swirl of thoughts in her head. She wasn't ready to make any decisions yet. Right now, her focus needed to be on Alicia. But deep down, Maya knew this was far from over. Daniel's mistake would have gone unnoticed if it hadn't been her in that situation. And that was the real problem, how many others had been mistreated without anyone caring. As if on cue, the door to Alicia's room creaked open. Dr. Marquez entered, his presence calm and reassuring as always. He had overseen Alicia's care for years, and Maya trusted him completely. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I'm all right," Maya replied, though the strain in her voice was clear. "How's Alicia?" "She's stable," Marquez reassured her. "Her injuries are serious, but she's a fighter." Maya let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. But the relief was short-lived as Marquez took a seat beside her, his tone growing more somber. "There's something else I wanted to mention," he said. "Officer Daniels, he's still here." Maya's eyes narrowed. "Of course he was. He's been asking to speak with you again," Marquez continued, "and he doesn't seem like he's leaving until he does." Maya felt a surge of irritation. The last thing she wanted was another confrontation with Daniels. She had made herself clear earlier what more was there to say. "Dr. Marquez, I appreciate the heads up," Maya said, her voice clipped. "But I've already said what I needed to say to Officer Daniels. I don't have anything more to discuss with him." Marquez nodded, though his brow furrowed in concern. "Maya, I've seen a lot in this hospital. And I've seen how people like you, people of color, are treated differently. What happened with Daniels today isn't just a mistake. It's part of something bigger. You have a platform, and people look to you for justice." Maya absorbed his words in silence. Marquez was right. This wasn't just about her or Daniels. It was about a system that had failed too many for too long. "I'll think about it," Maya said finally. "But you're right. This can't just end here." Satisfied, Marquez stood to leave, offering her a reassuring smile. As he stepped out, Maya felt the weight of what he had said sink in. She had been so focused on Alicia that she hadn't stopped to consider the larger picture. But now she couldn't ignore it. Daniels wasn't just a lone officer making a mistake, he was part of a system that had been broken for far too long. And as much as Maya wanted to focus on her sister's recovery, she knew she had a role to play in fixing it. Just then, the sound of footsteps in the hallway caught her attention. Maya turned and saw Daniels through the small window in the door. He looked different now, tense, vulnerable. The confidence he had displayed earlier was gone, replaced by uncertainty. Maya watched him, her mind racing. She could see the conflict on his face. He knew he had crossed a line, but he didn't know how to make it right. Part of Maya wanted to let him stew in that discomfort, to make him face the consequences of his actions. But another part of her, the part that believed in justice, in fairness, wanted to give him a chance to explain himself. After a brief hesitation, Maya stood and walked toward the door. She opened it slowly and stepped out into the hallway where Daniels waited. "Officer Daniels," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I see you're still here." Daniels looked up, his face pale. "I wanted to apologize again," he said quietly. "I know I didn't handle the situation right. I'm sorry, Judge Carter." Maya studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I appreciate the apology," she replied. "But apologies alone won't fix the problem. What are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again?" Daniels blinked, clearly caught off guard. He didn't have an answer, and Maya knew it. "That's what I thought," Maya said, her tone softening slightly. "Being sorry isn't enough. We all need to do better." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked back into Alicia's room, leaving Daniel standing alone in the hallway. This time he didn't follow her. Maya sat in the quiet hospital room, the air thick with tension. Alicia had fallen back into a restless sleep, her soft breaths filling the otherwise still atmosphere. Outside, the last traces of daylight faded into twilight, casting a purple glow over the city. The room, bathed in sterile light, felt stifling despite its openness. Maya's mind raced, replaying the events of the past few hours. Officer Daniels' stammered apology, his guilt and confusion, it haunted her. It wasn't just that he had acted out of fear or prejudice. It was the realization that even those who were supposed to protect and serve had no grasp of the broader consequences of their actions. In that moment, Maya understood that the system wasn't just flawed, it was built on ignorance and fear. And that fear infected even the enforcers of the law. As much as Maya wanted to hold Daniels accountable, she couldn't ignore the larger issue. He wasn't the first officer to make this mistake, and he wouldn't be the last. How could she take on a system that enabled such incidents over and over, with little to no real consequence? Maya had spent her career dismantling institutional biases in the legal system, but now, for the first time, the fight felt personal. Could she really carry this burden and make a difference? A deep sigh escaped her as she rubbed her temples, trying to ward off the growing headache. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. It was Sarah again. After a brief hesitation, Maya picked up the call. Judge Carter. Sarah's voice was calm, but there was an underlying urgency. We need to talk. The situation with Officer Daniels. It's gaining traction. I just spoke with a few contacts in the press. They're starting to ask questions. Maya closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the situation press down on her. This was exactly what she'd wanted to avoid. The last thing she needed was for this to turn into a media circus, with her personal ordeal becoming the latest headline. Sarah, I told you I don't want this to blow up. Alicia is my priority right now. The last thing I need is reporters swarming me while she's in the hospital. I understand, Sarah replied, her tone softening. But it's already starting to spread. People know something happened with you and the police. They don't have the full story yet, but once they start digging, it's only a matter of time. Maya bit her lip, weighing her options. She had never been one to back down from a fight, especially one that mattered. But this time, it wasn't just about justice, it was about her family. It was about the very real threat she'd faced, the vulnerability of being on the other side of the law she upheld. I need time to think, Maya said finally, her voice firmer now. I'm not ready to make any public statements. Sarah paused, clearly hesitant to push further. I understand, Judge Carter. But this could be an opportunity. You've spent your career fighting for justice. Now, you've experienced firsthand what so many people go through. People will listen to you. They need to hear from you. Maya let out a long breath. Sarah was right, of course. This was an opportunity. But it was also a burden, one that Maya wasn't sure she was ready to carry. I'll think about it, she said, more to herself than to Sarah. I'll call you when I'm ready. After ending the call, Maya sat in silence, staring at her phone. She couldn't ignore this forever. The world was watching now, waiting for her to act. And as much as she wanted to retreat, to focus on Alicia's recovery, she knew she couldn't. Not with everything at stake. But how could she move forward without sacrificing her own peace? How could she challenge Daniels and the system he represented without letting it consume her? As these questions swirled in her mind, the door creaked open. It wasn't a nurse or doctor, it was a woman Maya hadn't seen before. She was dressed in plain clothes, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, and there was something about her quiet confidence that immediately caught Maya's attention. Judge Carter, the woman said softly, stepping into the room. I'm Detective Michelle Harris. I'm investigating the incident involving Officer Daniels. May I have a moment of your time? Maya raised an eyebrow, surprised by the detective's presence. She hadn't expected the department to take action so quickly, let alone send a detective directly to her. This was unusual. Of course, Maya said, gesturing to the chair beside her. Please, have a seat. Detective Harris nodded and sat, pulling out a notepad. She studied Maya for a moment before speaking, her tone professional but measured. I understand you've been through a lot today, Harris began. I don't want to add to your stress, but I do need to gather some information about what happened with Officer Daniels. Maya nodded, folding her hands in her lap. I appreciate your sensitivity, Detective, but I'm curious why the sudden interest. It's unusual for an investigation to be launched this quickly. Harris smiled faintly, as if she had expected the question. It's not just about today, Judge Carter. There have been multiple complaints against Officer Daniels in the past. None resulted in formal action, but there's a pattern of behavior we've been monitoring. When your name came up in connection with this incident, it raised some flags. Maya's brow furrowed. A pattern of behavior? She wasn't entirely surprised Daniels had the air of someone who thrived on authority, who pushed boundaries when he thought he could. But multiple complaints without action. That was concerning. I see, Maya said thoughtfully. So, what happens now? Harris hesitated for a moment before responding. That depends. I'll file a report based on what you tell me today. From there, the Internal Review Board will decide if disciplinary action is warranted, but given your position and the circumstances, I expect this case will be taken very seriously. Maya nodded, though she felt a familiar sinking sensation. She had seen this before: complaints, investigations, and then officers like Daniels walking away with little more than a slap on the wrist. The system protected its own. Detective Harris, Maya said carefully, I appreciate that you're taking this seriously. But I've been in this system long enough to know that internal reviews don't always lead to meaningful change. How can I be sure this won't just get swept under the rug? Harris met Maya's gaze, her expression serious. You're right, Judge Carter. I can't promise you justice, but I can promise you that I'll do everything in my power to make sure your voice is heard. What happened today shouldn't have happened. Maya studied the detective for a moment, searching for any sign of insincerity. But Harris's steady gaze and quiet determination reassured her. Thank you, Maya said finally. I'll cooperate with the investigation, but I'm not interested in being used as a pawn. If I feel this is being mishandled, I won't hesitate to take it public. Harris nodded, understanding the gravity of Maya's words. I wouldn't expect anything less from you. I'll keep you informed every step of the way. The detective rose, offering a small smile. Thank you for your time, Judge Carter. As Harris left, Maya felt a sense of resolve solidifying within her. This was bigger than just her and Daniels. This was about a system that had failed too many for too long. She couldn't let this go, not without a fight. But Maya also knew the risks. Challenging the system would come at a personal cost to her career, her peace of mind. But it was a risk she was willing to take. If she didn't stand up now, who would? She glanced over at Alicia, still resting peacefully. Her sister's bruised face reflected the same strength Maya felt rising within her. Alicia had always been a fighter, just like her. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake. This was about holding the entire system accountable, and Maya Carter wasn't backing down. The hours crawled by after Detective Harris left. Maya sat next to Alicia, listening to the steady beeping of the monitors. The quiet hum of the night shift outside felt distant, and despite the hospital being full of people, The room felt isolating. Time seemed to stand still. But Maya couldn't rest. Not yet. Her mind kept returning to her conversation with Harris. The detective had seemed genuine, but Maya knew how easily these investigations could lose momentum. She had seen it too many times before, officers walking away with little more than a slap on the wrist. The system was rigged to protect its own, and it was maddening to watch from the inside, especially now that it was personal. Maya stood, her chest tight with tension. She walked over to the window, gazing out at the flickering city lights. It was quiet, almost surreal, as if the city itself was holding its breath. She inhaled deeply, trying to ground herself, to figure out her next move. Then came a knock at the door. Soft, hesitant. Maya turned, expecting to see a nurse or Dr. Marquez checking on Alicia. But when the door creaked open, it wasn't either of them. It was Officer Daniels. Her heart sank. What was he doing here? Why had he come back? He stood in the doorway, his posture tense, his eyes betraying a mixture of anxiety and desperation. The fluorescent lights from the hallway cast long shadows across his face, making him look almost haunted. He seemed smaller now, stripped of the arrogance he'd shown earlier. Now he looked like a man trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong. Judge Carter Daniels said, his voice low and cautious, "May I speak with you for a moment?" Maya crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "Why are you here, Officer Daniels? Haven't we already said everything that needs to be said?" Daniels swallowed hard, stepping inside the room, though he kept a respectful distance. He closed the door behind him, as if to shield their conversation from anyone passing by. I wanted to apologize again," he stammered. "I know what I did was wrong. I realize that now. But I also wanted to explain. Not to excuse myself, but I need you to understand." Maya's eyebrow lifted slightly. "Understand? Understand what? That you racially profiled me? That you assumed I was doing something wrong because I'm a black woman on a bike?" Daniels flinched at her words. He opened his mouth to respond, but Maya cut him off. She wasn't in the mood for another hollow apology. "You say you realize what you did was wrong," Maya continued, her voice cold but steady. "But do you actually understand why it was wrong? Or are you just here because you're afraid of what happens now that you know who I am?" Daniels exhaled sharply, his hands trembling. "It's not about that." "Well, maybe at first I didn't understand. I didn't know who you were, and I'm ashamed to admit that probably played a role. But now it's not just about who you are. I've realized it wasn't just one bad moment, it was everything that led up to it. My assumptions, my judgments, they were all wrong." Maya remained silent, studying him. He was struggling, trying to piece together his own failings. She could see that he wasn't used to confronting himself, to questioning his own actions. "I didn't grow up thinking this way," Daniels continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't set out to be that kind of cop. But over time, you start to see things a certain way. You stop questioning it. You just act. And I acted without thinking, without realizing the biases that were guiding me." He looked down, shame evident on his face. For the first time, Maya saw past his uniform, past his authority. She saw the vulnerability beneath the cracks in his facade. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Daniels said, meeting her gaze again. "But I need you to know that I'm trying to understand this, to understand how I became the kind of person who could do what I did." Maya felt a strange mixture of emotions rise within her. Part of her wanted to unleash the anger and frustration that had been building inside her since that moment outside the hospital. But another part, a quieter, more empathetic part recognized the sincerity in his words. She had seen it before in others, people who had made mistakes but were desperate for redemption, for a chance to make things right. But did Daniels deserve that chance? Maya took a step closer, her arms still crossed. "You acted without thinking," she said, her tone measured. "That's the problem, Officer Daniels. You didn't think. And because you didn't, you made me feel like less than a person. Like I was a criminal just for trying to reach my sister. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Daniels' face tightened. He shook his head slowly. "No, I don't. And that's part of the problem. I've never had to think about what it feels like to be on the other side. I've never been in your shoes." Maya's gaze softened slightly, though her posture remained firm. She could see the realization dawning in his eyes. He wasn't just apologizing for one bad decision. He was coming to terms with a lifetime of unchecked biases, of assumptions he had never questioned. That was something far more difficult to confront. "I'm not here to teach you a lesson," Maya said quietly. "That's not my job. But if you're serious about making things right, you need to do more than just apologize. You need to reflect on yourself, your actions, and figure out how to change. This can't happen again, not to me, not to anyone." Daniels nodded, his face pale and drawn. "I know, I will. I swear." Maya studied him for a long moment, choosing her next words carefully. She didn't want to let him off the hook, but if there was a chance he could learn from this, maybe something good could come from the mess. "I'm going to cooperate with the investigation," Maya said finally. "I'll tell them exactly what happened, and they'll decide what consequences you'll face. That's out of my hands now." Daniels nodded again, his eyes filled with both fear and relief. "Thank you," he whispered. "I know I don't deserve it, but thank you." Maya didn't respond. She turned back to Alicia's bedside as she heard Daniels leave the room. His footsteps were soft and tentative, as if he were afraid of making too much noise. When the door clicked shut, the silence of the room returned. For a long time, Maya stood there, gazing down at her sister. Alicia's face was peaceful, untouched by the turmoil that raged outside. Maya gently brushed a strand of hair from Alicia's forehead, her heart aching with love and worry. She had almost lost her today. The thought made her chest tighten. But as the minutes passed, a new resolve began to settle within her. The anger and frustration hadn't disappeared, but now they were accompanied by something else. A sense of purpose. A determination to take control of the situation not just for herself, but for everyone who had been mistreated by a system meant to protect them. Maya pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed. She hesitated for a moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. Once she made this call, there would be no turning back. The investigation would take on a life of its own, and the public would soon know everything. It would be a battle, and it could cost her more than just her peace of mind. But it was a battle that needed to be fought. With steady hands, Maya pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before Sarah picked up. Judge Carter. Maya took a deep breath. "Sarah, I'm ready." There was a pause, and Maya heard the relief in Sarah's voice. "I'll make the calls." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Maya replied, her voice firm. "It's time." After hanging up, Maya stood by the window, gazing at the city below. The darkness outside seemed less oppressive now, as if the weight of the night had lifted. There was still so much ahead, battles to fight, conversations to have. But for the first time in hours, Maya felt a sense of clarity. She knew what needed to be done, and she was ready to face it. As the city began to stir with the early signs of dawn, Maya realized that this moment was not just about her. It was about everyone who had been wronged, silenced, ignored. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was theirs. The sun had begun to rise, casting a pale, golden light over the city skyline. From the hospital window, Maya watched the streets below as they slowly came back to life. The stillness of the early morning hours gave way to the hum of traffic, the rush of pedestrians, and the murmur of voices beginning their day. But inside the hospital, time felt different, slower, more deliberate, as if the world outside had little effect on the tension within. Maya stood by the window, her thoughts heavy with everything that had transpired. The call to Sarah had set things in motion. By now, Sarah would have reached out to key figures in the press, and within hours, Maya knew the story would break. She had made the decision to go public, not for herself, but because she knew it was the only way to force real change. What had happened between her and Officer Daniels was not just an isolated incident, it was a symptom of a much larger problem, a problem that needed to be exposed. As Maya gathered her thoughts, the door to Alicia's room creaked open once again. This time it was Dr. Marquez, holding a clipboard in one hand, his expression calm but focused. He nodded to Maya, gesturing for her to join him in the hallway. Maya glanced at Alicia, who was still asleep, then followed Marquez out of the room. In the corridor, the doctor spoke softly, his tone professional but sympathetic. "Judge Carter, I wanted to give you an update on your sister's condition." Maya's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Is there any change?" she asked, her voice betraying none of the anxiety she felt. Marquez nodded slowly. "The good news is that Alicia is stable. Her vital signs are strong, and she's responding well to treatment. However, she will need surgery to repair the fractures in her leg, and it's important that we schedule it soon." Maya exhaled, relieved that Alicia's condition wasn't worsening but still anxious about the road ahead. "How soon are we talking?" she asked. "We're looking to operate this afternoon," Marquez explained. "It's a complex procedure, but we have an excellent surgical team ready. I just wanted to make sure you were aware and had time to prepare." Maya nodded, her mind racing as she processed the information. Surgery was serious, but it was also a step toward recovery. Alicia was a fighter, and Maya had no doubt that her sister would pull through. Still, the thought of her lying on the operating table made Maya's heart clench. "Thank you, Dr. Marquez," Maya said quietly. "I appreciate you keeping me informed." Marquez offered a reassuring smile. "We'll take good care of her, Judge Carter. She's in the best hands." Maya watched as he walked down the hallway, disappearing around the corner. The hospital felt colder now, more sterile. The weight of everything, Alicia's condition, the situation with Daniels, the impending media storm pressed down on Maya, making it difficult to breathe. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. She needed to focus, to compartmentalize her emotions. Alicia needed her to be strong, to be present. But Maya couldn't ignore the larger fight that was waiting for her outside these hospital walls. The decision to go public had set off a chain of events that would soon be beyond her control. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She pulled it out and saw Sarah's name on the screen. The timing was unmistakable. Sarah had news. Sarah's voice was calm but urgent. "It's starting." Maya swallowed, her grip tightening on the phone. "What's starting?" "The press," Sarah replied. "They've picked up the story. We kept your name out of it for now, but they know a high-profile figure was involved in an altercation with the police. It's only a matter of time before they connect the dots. Maya felt a surge of adrenaline course through her veins. She had expected this, but it still hit harder than she had anticipated. Once the media got hold of her name, the story would explode. The public would demand answers, and the pressure on the police department would intensify. But that was the point, wasn't it? To shine a light on the injustice, to make sure Daniels and others like him were held accountable. "What's the department's response so far?" Maya asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "They're being tight-lipped," Sarah said. "No official statement yet. But I've heard through my contacts that they're scrambling to contain the situation. Internal Affairs is involved, and there's talk of a formal investigation." Maya exhaled, the weight of the situation settling deeper on her shoulders. Internal Affairs meant business if they were involved. Daniels wouldn't be able to walk away from this unscathed. But Maya also knew how these things could go. Investigations could be drawn out, quietly swept under the rug if the public's attention shifted. She needed to keep the pressure on. "Sarah, I want to make a statement," Maya said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked carefully. "Once you go public, there's no turning back." "I'm sure," Maya replied, her voice firm. "People need to know what happened. They need to understand that this isn't just about me. It's about the system. It's about every person of color who's been stopped, harassed, or mistreated because of the way they look. This is bigger than me, Sarah. And it's time we bring it out into the light." Sarah didn't argue. She understood the gravity of Maya's decision. "All right," she said. "I'll draft the statement and send it to you for approval. We'll get it out to the press as soon as you're ready." Maya nodded, though Sarah couldn't see it. "Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate everything you've done." "Of course," Sarah replied. "We'll get through this, Maya. I promise." After ending the call, Maya leaned back against the wall, her heart pounding. The decision had been made. She was going to take this fight public. She was going to use her voice, her platform, to expose what had happened, to expose the system that had allowed it to happen. It wasn't just about Officer Daniels. It was about all the other officers like him, the ones who operated with impunity, knowing that the system would protect them. But Maya wasn't naive. She knew that by going public, she was opening herself up to scrutiny. People would question her motives, her actions, even her identity as a Supreme Court justice. They would dig into her past, searching for anything they could use against her. The media frenzy would be relentless. But Maya had never been one to back down from a fight, especially not one as important as this. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, Maya felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The decision had been made, and now all that was left was to see it through. She would speak out, and she would keep speaking out until people started listening. The world needed to know that the system was broken, and that it wasn't just broken for her. It was broken for everyone who had ever been marginalized, silenced, or mistreated by those in power. Maya stood up, squaring her shoulders. Alicia would have her surgery today, and Maya would be there for her, just as she always had been. But once Alicia was stable, Maya would turn her attention to the fight ahead. There was no going back now. With one last glance out the window, Maya turned and walked back into her sister's room. Alicia's breathing was steady, her face calm in sleep. Maya sat down beside her, gently taking her hand. For now, this was where she needed to be, by her sister's side, offering comfort and strength. But soon, she would be stepping back into the spotlight. And when she did, the world would hear her roar. The days that followed were a whirlwind. As predicted, the story exploded in the media. Headlines splashed across every major outlet: Supreme Court Justice detained in racial profiling incident, Justice Carter confronts police misconduct, and high-profile case sparks nationwide debate on law enforcement bias. Maya's decision to go public had ignited a firestorm, and now she was at the center of a national conversation that seemed to be growing louder by the hour. It was exactly what Maya had wanted, yet nothing could have prepared her for the intensity of it all. The interviews, the op-eds, the public statements, it was overwhelming, relentless. But Maya stood firm, determined to see this through. She had spent years fighting for justice in the courtroom, but now the fight had moved into the public sphere, and she wasn't going to back down. Not when there was so much at stake. Every day, her phone buzzed with messages of support and, predictably, backlash. Some people questioned her motives, accusing her of using her position to incite division, while others praised her for her courage in speaking out. The media painted her as both a hero and a villain, depending on the outlet, but Maya didn't let it shake her resolve. She wasn't doing this for praise or recognition, she was doing it because the system had to change. Officer Daniels, too, was caught in the storm. The department had placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of the internal affairs investigation. The public scrutiny was harsh, and Daniels' name was now synonymous with the worst aspects of racial profiling and abuse of power. Maya knew that Daniels was only one part of the larger issue, but his actions had become a symbol of the deep-rooted problems within law enforcement. The entire country was watching, waiting to see what the department would do next. And then, one morning, the department released its statement. Maya sat at her kitchen table, her phone in hand, reading through the official report. The department had found that Daniels had acted inappropriately and had violated multiple procedural guidelines during his interaction with her. He would face disciplinary action, though the specifics remained unclear. There was talk of retraining, a possible demotion, but no mention of termination. The conclusion felt hollow, incomplete, like a half-hearted attempt to appease the public without truly addressing the core of the problem. Maya's phone buzzed again, and this time it was a call from Sarah. "They're trying to sweep it under the rug," Sarah said, her frustration evident. "They think they can get away with a slap on the wrist." Maya had anticipated this. She had seen it happen before, officers protected by the shield of bureaucracy, facing minimal consequences for actions that had profound impacts on people's lives. But Maya wasn't about to let it end there. "They won't get away with it," Maya said, her voice firm. "We've come too far to let this die down now. We keep pushing. The public is behind us." Sarah paused, then asked, "What's your next move?" Maya didn't hesitate. "I'm going to call for an independent review. We need external pressure, people who aren't tied to the department, who can look at this objectively. The city council needs to be involved, and I'll push for a full-scale investigation into the department's practices." Sarah was silent for a moment, clearly impressed. "You're not backing down, are you?" "Never," Maya replied. "This is about more than just Daniels. It's about changing the entire culture." The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and meetings. Maya reached out to local and national leaders, aligning herself with organizations that had been fighting for police reform for years. The momentum was on her side, and she intended to use it. Her voice carried weight, and now she was using it not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been wronged by a system that too often turned a blind eye. By the time evening fell, Maya found herself back at the hospital, sitting beside Alicia's bed. The surgery had gone well, and Alicia was slowly recovering, her strength returning day by day. Maya took her sister's hand, feeling the warmth of her skin, grateful that she was still here. "You did it," Alicia said softly, her voice still weak but full of pride. "You took them on, and you didn't back down." Maya smiled, squeezing her sister's hand gently. "I'm not done yet," she replied. "There's still so much work to do." Alicia nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know. But you're doing it, Maya. You're making a difference." Maya sat back, her mind still racing with thoughts of the battles ahead. But for the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace. The path forward was long, and it wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, challenges, moments of doubt. But Maya knew she was on the right path. The fight for justice was never straightforward, never simple. It required patience, persistence, and courage. And Maya had all three. As the night deepened and the hospital grew quiet, Maya looked out the window, the city lights glowing softly in the distance. She knew that this was only the beginning. The movement she had sparked was gaining momentum, and she would keep pushing, keep fighting, until real change was achieved. Officer Daniels would face the consequences of his actions, but more importantly, the system that had allowed those actions to occur would be forced to reckon with its failures. Maya had seen to that. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the start of something much bigger, and for the first time in a long while Maya felt hopeful.